Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dennis Gove. I'm a senior engineer in the platform security group at Bloomberg. Bloomberg, just a quick introduction of what we do. We're a global leader in business and financial information. Our goal is to deliver trusted data, news, and insights for transparency and fairness into financial markets. We've got over 20,000 employees. 7,000 of those are engineers. We work in 167 locations across the world. And to answer the question from before, yes, we are hiring aggressively. So, there's always engineering jobs available. Okay, cool. So there are three things that I want to talk about today. First, we're going to get into why domain management is such an integral part of our adoption of SPIRE. And then we're briefly going to go through the current mechanisms for that management and some of the reasons why it's not quite enough for us at Bloomberg. And then finally, I want to discuss the features that I think are necessary for us to achieve the goals that we have at Bloomberg. So we've made a conscious choice as a company to utilize a variety of environments and tech stacks for all of our systems. And there are the obvious reasons for this, like using the right technology for each of your products, foremost of which is the Bloomberg terminal. But we also have business continuity reasons, such as not being tied to a single technology or a single vendor. So we make a conscious choice to use different things when we feel a need to. So one of the outcomes of this is that our systems are very dynamic and mixed in nature. So we have applications running on a variety of hardware and operating systems. We have Linux, Solaris, AIX, and Windows all in play. We run workloads under multiple orchestration systems. We use containers and basic Unix processes. We use bare metal, virtual machines, Kubernetes, and we run in our own private data centers as well as in public clouds. So the point is, we purposely don't put all of our eggs in one basket, and that presents challenges when we're talking about core infrastructure. We need to manage our infrastructure across a variety of environments. So we want and need consistent management interfaces and workflows. The necessary actions in a particular environment is going to be specific to that environment, but the way we approach those actions should really be consistent across all of them. Consistent integrated workflows, particularly when managing core infrastructure, just gives us a lot of operational resiliency. And as we explore bringing SPIRE into our infrastructure, one of the important things that we've had to consider is how can we handle the management of trust domains in a way that allows us to make it part of our existing workflows, the automated ones, the manual ones, and the disaster recovery ones. Can we utilize our existing infrastructure, or do we need to duplicate some information? Can people and systems perform their tasks? And can we do this in a way that doesn't assume SPIRE is the only game in town? We already have management UIs, infrastructure controllers, provisioners, asset tracking, and access control systems. And we use these to manage all of our other infrastructure, so there's no reason not to do the same with SPIRE. And it's just a reality at any reasonably sized enterprise. We already have management systems and workflows in place, so we should strive to incorporate them or incorporate new technologies into those workflows. And we want to avoid building closed systems for each new technology. Long-term maintenance would just be an incredible nightmare if we didn't approach it this way. From a technology perspective, SPIFFE and SPIRE are absolutely things that we want to use and bring into our organization. But as we've explored this path, we've run into some domain management difficulties. We haven't decided exactly how many trust domains we're going to deploy, but we're approaching it with an eye towards being dynamic about what we have. One reason for this is because of our varied environments. Another is because we want to limit the blast radius when issues occur, both for stability reasons and security reasons. We know that this adds a lot of extra effort in the beginning, but we found that this is just a prudent approach when dealing with core infrastructure. What that decision means is that we're going to be running more than just a handful of trust domains. And this means that our management layers must be able to interact with each and affect actual changes in them. We need to identify applications and people calling into the management APIs, and we need to control access for both types of clients. The client registering a workload isn't necessarily the same client that's going to be registering a node and so forth. So taken in isolation, right, SPIRE's Admin API provides us with a lot of the core functionality that we want. Through it, we can register and evict nodes, we can enable and disable federation, we can muck with workloads, we can change selectors. There are a bunch of other things that we can do. And it's a very feature-rich API, and it's not the problem that I'm talking about, right? The API itself is probably more than we actually need in the long run. But there are facets about it that don't work well for us. First is related to client authentication. There are two basic paths available. Option one, client is running locally with the SPIRE server, connecting over the domain socket, and is able to act as an administrator. The ability to connect to the socket is enough for the SPIRE server to allow all admin actions. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a problem for us. We're totally fine with something running locally with a server being trusted. That's not an issue. The second option is for a client calling into the API via the gRPC interfaces. In such a setup, client opens up an MTLS connection with the SPIRE server using an X509 SVID from the same trust domain. That is that the admin client must be a workload within the trust domain that it's managing. And until recently, it was also necessary for the client to be marked as an administrator within the workload registry. That flow is still supported, but now you can also give the SPIRE server an open policy agent rule set, which allows certain clients to perform certain actions. But even when this is enabled, the client must still have an SVID in this trust domain. The requirement that the client is either local or authenticated within the same trust domain prevents me from using my existing infrastructure to manage SPIRE. Of course, I could move my administrative infrastructure into the trust domain, but it only works for one of them, right? The current functionality in SPIRE doesn't allow me to operate across a bunch of domains, which really limits my ability to integrate SPIRE into my infrastructure. So this brings us to Turnyak, which is part of SPIFFE's GitHub organization. The project description reads as, Turnyak aims to provide a management plane and capabilities for SPIFFE identities managed by SPIRE. Sounds very promising. It's offering to provide a management plane for multiple SPIRE domains. The diagram that we're seeing here is focused on two components. First is the Turnyak server, which runs alongside SPIRE servers. Second is the Turnyak manager. And as far as I can tell, that accepts requests from client operators, authenticates and authorizes them, and then calls down to the appropriate Turnyak server to interact with an individual SPIRE server. Turnyak does have a UI, but I couldn't find a diagram that's showing both the UI and the Turnyak manager. So the operator icon up here is implying that it's both direct API calls and an interactive website interacting with it. The session immediately following this one is going to focus on Turnyak, so I'm not going to go into too much depth on it. But there are a couple things here that I want to touch upon. The first piece I want to talk about is the operator authentication. Turnyak Manager currently uses basic authentication. There is active work being done to support a single sign-on provider called Keycloak, and there are discussions about integrating with IAM for user management and authorization. In both of those cases, as far as I can tell, I'm going to need to bring in another piece of infrastructure into my world, whether that's standing up a Keycloak system or becoming very dependent on AWS for user management. I already have user management piece in my infrastructure, so I don't really want to bring something else in. The Turnyak Manager database exists in part to store information about the SPIRE servers that are in play. It'll have the server address and certificates and keys used during the connection down to the Turnyak server instance. There are two things here that I want to mention. First, I already have systems tracking where my SPIRE servers are running, so I don't necessarily want to duplicate that information in another database. Second, it doesn't appear that Turnyak uses SVIDs when communicating between the manager and servers. I'm curious why that is, and if I'm understanding it correctly, because I may not be, right? As far as I can tell, Turnyak manages its own certificates independently of SPIRE. Next, we've got the Turnyak server and database. Basic idea here is that the Turnyak server acts as a proxy for the SPIRE server. It exposes all of the standard SPIRE Admin API endpoints, but allows calls from clients which can't call the SPIRE server directly. Something like this, running locally with the SPIRE server and interacting directly with its admin API, has very privileged access to the system. Because of that, I think it's prudent to limit its functionality to only what's absolutely necessary. First, authenticate the caller using well-established mechanisms. Second, authorize the caller. Clients should be explicitly authorized to register and evict nodes, add and delete workload entries, and muck with federation. And then allow me to make those decisions using access systems that I already have in my infrastructure. Turniak server is the enforcement point, but let me point it at some external decision point. And finally, we have the policy login and CA pieces. Turniak is set up to manage its own ACL rules for both the manager and the server components. And this sounds very reasonable because, as I've said, we need access control, but in managing those rules itself makes it very difficult for me to integrate with my organization's existing access control systems. Also, Turniak appears to be dealing with SPIRE, agent log collection, and that's not a role that I think that something like this should be filling. I already have systems in place to collect logs across my infrastructure, so I don't need Turniak doing anything like that. And to accomplish something like log collection, the Turniak server needs to have additional functionality, which in my view just increases its possible vulnerabilities. It's not worth it. Turniak is trying to solve a very difficult problem, but to me, it appears to be approaching it from a mindset of a closed system, one that Turniak is in full control of, doesn't consider ways that it can integrate with my organization's existing infrastructure. Authentication and authorization are limited. Tracking what's running and how to communicate with it adds a requirement for databases. Trying to do everything, even actions not related to node and workload registration or domain federation or so forth, causes it to do too much and be a little too complicated. But please, don't get me wrong. Turniak has its use case. But from an enterprise perspective, where what I really want and need is to integrate SPIRE management into my existing workflows, just not the right solution for us. So the diagram that we're seeing here is more of an abstract view of what I need a SPIFFE management system to support. It's very similar to Turniak in structure, but allows enterprises to integrate their own pieces of infrastructure when and how they need to. And I can do this the same way that SPIRE is able to integrate with my infrastructure, with plugins. What we're seeing here is an action we'll all need to perform at some point: disable an image because it has a vulnerability. We start off with a person logged into some UI, but it's not necessarily a SPIRE specific one. Just an example system where someone might manage known vulnerabilities and disable image usage. One of the things they could do is mark an image as untrusted and remove its ability to be authenticated. As part of that workflow, a request is made to the SPIFFE Management API to find and remove any registration entries using that image. Management API accepts that request, authenticates the caller using our existing SSO infrastructure. That could be integrated into the API with a plugin, or it could be part of our service mesh. Either way, Manager API is able to authenticate a person or an application in a variety of different ways. Manager API sees that the user wants to disable foo service version 142 and uses asset tracking plugins to reach out to other systems that know where those things are running. This process allows us to integrate with external systems that can tell me where the image is configured to run, the trust domains that it's running on, and even the addresses of those trust domain servers. The plugin allows me to abstract out how this SPIFFE manager figures out where different components are running. Then the manager reaches out to some external access control system and asks, is Dennis allowed to delete workloads in these domains? The manager doesn't care how that decision is made, it just cares that it is made. Plugin creates that separation that allows something else to make the decision so that the manager can enforce it. And then the manager reaches out to each affected SPIFFE system to disable usage of the image, whatever that means in the SPIFFE implementation. Obviously, SPIRE is one of those, so there'll be a plugin specific to interacting with the SPIRE API. But perhaps I'm using something other than SPIRE in some part of my organization. The manager should be able to interact with those as well. The ability to customize the Manager API with plugins at the necessary points is what will allow a broader usage across a wide range of organizations. So earlier I said that SPIRE's current admin API doesn't allow us to easily work across multiple domains. Hopefully, over time, we'll be able to enhance the admin API to support such cases. But in the meantime, And again, very similar to Turniak's approach, we're going to need an API proxy running locally with each SPIRE server. However, the proposed approach has a few differences from Turniak. First, it'll expose nothing more than the SPIRE Admin API. It doesn't need to do anything except authenticate the caller, verify their ability to do what's being asked, and then forward that request to the SPIRE server. That's it. The proxy will support clients from other trust domains using standard federation. And from there, also using a plugin, it would reach out to my existing access control system. Same interface as before. Is the actor allowed to perform this action on this trust domain? You make the decision, the proxy will enforce it. The access is allowed, proxy then forwards the request to the SPIRE server over the local domain socket and shares the response back to the caller, and it does nothing else. Such an approach allows us to centrally manage lots of trust domains, and utilizing plugins allows me to integrate into our existing management workflows. It allows us to add a layer of abstraction without losing our security rules. So as I finish up, I want to touch upon what I'm hoping has come across as the common theme for enterprise integration, and that is options. No enterprise is the same. We all have bespoke solutions. We all have things that make sense only in our worlds, but are critical to them. And we all have integration challenges. In my opinion, one of the best features of SPIRE is its use of plugins. They allow us to benefit from workload and federation APIs while giving us enough options to work within our worlds. It avoids being prescriptive about things that it doesn't need to be. And as the community explores ways to improve the management of SPIRE and SPIFFE systems, I hope we'll follow the same path and allow choice wherever possible so that we can all benefit from the core functionality when we're working in new systems. Thank you. Love to take questions.
Then for the super insightful, would it be in the initial scope to support the rest of the gRPC transcoding?
There is no initial scope at this point. This is just what I want to exist. We obviously have had discussions about how we might implement it and what it would do. Being able to accept requests over like HTTP and authenticate the caller, et cetera, absolutely, right? You're never always going to be using gRPC. You're never always going to be using MTLS or something like that. Sometimes you just need to use basic TLS over an HTTP connection, authenticate the caller that way, like every website does, and you're good to go. Yeah.
And if you were to dynamically generate line bindings or whatever language determines when it's okay,
That's correct. Yeah. Were there any online questions?
Online questions in here.
Other questions online, folks? Can you?
What's the path to manifest your idea?
The first path is just hearing from other folks in the community that it is actually something people want, and I'm not off the wall on this, right? Like maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm absolutely wrong, but if I'm not, then I want to start moving forward on kind of how we can do this at a community level. Not awesome that you complained about it, but awesome that I'm not alone.
I've thought about this before.
Okay. All right. And I'll say this has been our biggest hurdle for integrating SPIRE into our infrastructure. SPIRE itself, we love. SPIFFE, we love. Management of it has been our hurdle.
Bring your own control plane. That was for basically the main theme.
More on the subject of trust domains, would different trust domains have different configuration parameters? Say different kinds of lead to the research?
Yeah. One of our splits is absolutely going to be different security constraints and different TTLs on things. And you know, we're not planning to split them just on like the SLA level of like dev, beta, alpha, prod. We're going to be splitting them much more finely grained than that. But we haven't decided exactly how. But part of it is, yes, the configuration options will probably be different for their particular use case. Yeah.
I think the best path forward is to have a joint discussions with Torniak and figure out how to start building the management control plane. for the deployment.
That is my ideal for these ideas to become part of Turniak. I don't want to build a second thing. I want to work within Turniak because the overall goal of it is exactly what I want. So.
Yeah, and in order to make lots of the things happen, there is also lots of work needs to be done in Aspire as well to support all this. So.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank